Chapter 13 Traitor at the funeral. Michael sat with his family as people walked past, one by one, throwing flowers onto his father's grave. Michael studied their faces carefully. Clemenza, Tessio, Enzo the butcher, Johnny Fontaine, all the people that his father had helped in his long and dangerous life. Some of his enemies were at the funeral too. Barzini threw a red rose onto the grave and lowered his eyes respectfully in Michael's direction. Michael stared at him coldly as he turned and walked away. A few minutes later, Tessio walked up to Michael and whispered something in his ear. Michael stood up and walked away from the grave to hear what Tessio wanted to say. Barzini wants to arrange a meeting, Tessio said. He says we can solve all our problems. Did you talk to him? Yes, I can arrange everything. Trust me. Michael looked at Tessio. He had known him all his life. He had always been like an uncle to him, but Michael remembered his father's words. Whoever comes to you with this Barzini meeting, he's the traitor, and he felt a great sadness in his heart. All right, Michael said quietly, and he returned to his seat by his father's grave. He told Tom, who was sitting next to him, about his conversation with Tessio. Tom shook his head sadly. I always thought it would be Clemenza, he said. No, said Michael, this is a clever move, and Tessio's cleverer than Clemenza. But I'm going to wait. I've decided to be godfather to Connie's baby, and then I'm going to meet Barzini, Tartaglia, and all the heads of the 5 families. He watched Tessio, who was standing some distance away, shaking hands and talking with Barzini. He hadn't told Tom the whole truth. Tom was not a consigliere anymore, so he didn't know everything in the way that he used to. The truth was that Michael had already decided to kill all his enemies. They were going to die on the day he stood as godfather to Connie's child. Chapter 14 Michael Rizzi, go in peace. As Michael walked into the church with Kay, Connie, Carlo and the rest of the family, his men were all over New York, getting ready to kill his enemies. Pete Clemenza kissed his wife goodbye and left the house carrying a large flower box under his arm. Michael's personal bodyguard, Albert Neri, was putting on a policeman's uniform. Clemenza's close friend, Rocco Lampin, was sitting with his eyes closed in a large hotel, while a man gave him a shave. 2 other men who worked for the family were checking their machine guns in a small apartment room somewhere in a cheap part of the city. Kay stood in the church, Connie's baby sleeping in her arms. The priest spoke Latin and touched the baby's cheeks and mouth with water. Then he asked Michael, do you believe in God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Michael said, I do. Albert Neri was standing on the pavement in his policeman's uniform. He was talking to the driver of a car which was parked in front of the plaza building, trying to make him move away. The driver shook his head and refused to move. Pete Clemenza was running up a lot of stairs in a dark hotel, the flower box under his arm. His fat face was hot and red, and he was very short of breath. Rocco Lampin checked his face in the mirror, paid the man in the hotel who had given him the shave, and calmly walked out of the door. The 2 men with machine guns looked at each other and, without a word, walked out of their apartment. The baby in Kay's arms woke up and began to cry. He didn't like the water on his face. Barzini appeared at the top of the steps of the plaza building with his bodyguard. Looking down, he saw his driver arguing with a policeman on the pavement, so he sent his bodyguard down to find out what the problem was. Rocco Lampin waited near the desk in the hotel entrance and smoked a cigarette. Pete Clemenza reached the top of the stairs and rested against a wall outside a lift, completely out of breath. Michael Francis Rizzi, the priest, spoke to the crying baby. Do you refuse Satan and everything that Satan does? Clemenza waited outside the lift. Suddenly, the doors opened and a small, thin man with silver hair, a red flower in the buttonhole of his expensive suit, stepped out. It was Cuneo, one of the New York godfathers who had been at the meeting with Don Corleone 3 years before. He stopped when he saw Clemenza, a look of confusion on his face. Clemenza lifted his short, fat leg and kicked Cuneo hard in the stomach. Cuneo fell backwards into the lift. Clemenza quickly opened his flower box and took out a large shotgun. He pointed it at Cuneo and fired. I do refuse Satan, Michael spoke quietly to the priest, answering for the baby, and everything that Satan does. The baby went on crying. A man in a white suit walked past the desk where Rocco Lampin was waiting. He was on his way out of the hotel. This was Strachey, another New York godfather. As he was halfway through the revolving doors, Lampin ran from the desk and locked the door to stop it turning. Strachey was caught inside. He tried to push, but the doors wouldn't move. He hit the glass with his hands. He turned round and found himself face to face with the end of Rocco Lampen's gun. He put his hands up and pressed himself against the door behind him. Rocco fired, and the bullets crashed through the glass of the door straight into Strachey's heart. Philip Tartaglia had left his bodyguards outside in the street while he had a secret meeting with his girlfriend in a small room in a cheap part of New York. This was his last mistake. As he was kissing her, the door burst open and two men with machine guns rushed in. As Tartaglia looked around for his gun, the girl jumped to her feet and screamed. The gunmen opened fire on Tartaglia, and the girl fell back in a shower of bullets. Then the gunmen left as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind them a smoke-filled room and two dead bodies in a pile of torn and bloody bedclothes. The priest held a silver spoon above the baby's head and let drops of water fall onto the baby's face. In nomen Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, the priest said. Barzini's bodyguard ran down the steps of the plaza building and called to the policeman, who was writing something in his notebook. The policeman put away his notebook, took out his handgun and shot the bodyguard dead. The driver of the car put up his hands, but there was no pity in Albert Neri's heart. He killed him too. Barzini, who was halfway down the steps, turned and began to walk quickly back up towards the building. He was a proud man. He never liked to run too fast for anything, not even when his life was in danger. This gave Neri the time that he needed to go down on one knee, point his gun carefully up at Barzini, and shoot him 3 times in the back. Barzini stopped, as if in surprise, then fell backwards down the steps. Suddenly, inside the church, the baby stopped crying. Michael Rizzi, go in peace, the priest said. And God go with you always. Amen. Amen, Michael Corleone said softly, and lowered his eyes knowing that, by now, all his enemies were dead. Chapter 15 Family Business. As the family stood on the steps outside the church, Carlo Rizzi shook Michael's hand. Thank you, Godfather, thank you, he kept saying, tears of happiness in his eyes. I was pleased to do it, Michael said, then added, without smiling, now, Carlo, could you go and wait for me in the house? I'm afraid we can't go with our families to visit Las Vegas today. We'll have to wait here for a couple of days. You can join Connie and your children then, okay? Okay, Carlo said. He knew better than to show he was unhappy. Michael had been very good to him. He had welcomed him into the family. He had been godfather to his son. He did whatever Michael wanted him to do. He never argued. When Carlo had gone, Michael kissed his wife and his sister and left them on the steps outside the church. He had more business to take care of. Tassio was ringing Barzini's office from the wall phone in Tom Hagen's kitchen, not knowing that Barzini was already dead. Tell Barzini we're on our way to Brooklyn, he said. After the call, he turned to Tom, who was waiting for him, and said, I hope Mike gets what he wants from the meeting tonight. I'm sure he will. Tom nodded seriously. He followed Tassio out of the house. They were halfway across the street to Michael's house when they were stopped by a bodyguard. The boss says he'll come in another car, the man said. He says you two can go before him. Tassio looked worried. He can't do that, he said, turning to Tom. That spoils all my arrangements. 3 more bodyguards appeared from nowhere and stood around him. Then Tom said gently, I can't go with you either, Tassio. Tassio understood everything immediately. He knew that he was going to die for trying to betray Michael. He looked at Tom sadly and said, Tell Mike it was only business. I always liked him. He understands that. Hagen nodded. Tassio paused for a second. He was a brave man, but he couldn't stop himself from showing Tom a moment of plain, human weakness. Tom, can you help me? He asked. As a friend. Tom shook his head and looked away. He didn't want to show his feelings, but inside he felt sick. Tassio had always been the best soldier in the Corleone family. I'm sorry, Tassio, I can't do that, he said, and walked away. Tom watched from his window as the 4 bodyguards led Tassio towards a waiting car and drove him away for his meeting, not with Barzini, but with death. Carlo Rizzi was sitting in his front room, making a phone call, when something made him turn round. Michael was watching him from the doorway. Tom Hagen and a bodyguard were standing quietly behind him. Carlo saw the icy look in Michael's eyes, and he felt his whole body go weak. "Carlo, you have to answer for Sonny," Michael said. Carlo didn't answer. He stood up, pretending not to understand. "You betrayed Sonny," Michael continued in a cold, flat voice. "Did you really think you could fool a Corleone? You played a game, didn't you? You made Sonny angry by hitting your own wife. You knew that he'd come to help her." Carlo began to shake with fear. "I promise you, on my son's life, I'm innocent. Mike, don't do this to me, please." But Michael calmly made him sit down next to him. "Barzini's dead," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Carlo's frightened face. "Philip Tattaglia's dead too. Cuneo, Strachey, they're all gone. Today, I'm taking care of all family business. So don't tell me you're innocent. Don't lie to me." Carlo started to cry, but he didn't say anything. Tom Hagen gave him a drink, and Michael put a brotherly arm around his shoulder. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I'm not going to kill you. You're my sister's husband. I'm your son's godfather. No. I'm going to throw you out of the family business. I am putting you on a plane to Las Vegas to join your family. I want you to stay there. That's going to be your punishment. Now please, don't tell me you're innocent, because that insults my intelligence. It makes me very angry. Tell me what happened. Who killed Sonny? Barzini or Tattaglia?" Carlo stopped crying and looked up with a sudden feeling of hope. He saw Michael's eyes close to his. They looked warm and full of forgiveness. He swallowed the rest of his drink and smiled at Michael with a grateful look in his eyes. "It was Barzini," he said quietly. "Good. Good," Michael said, nodding to himself. He stood up and turned towards the window. "There's a car waiting for you outside," he said. "It'll take you to the airport. I'll call Connie to tell her you're coming." Carlo stood up and tried to speak. "Michael, please," but Michael turned on him angrily, his eyes cold and hard again. "Get out of here," he said. "I never want to see you again." When Carlo left the house, he saw two men putting suitcases into the back of his car. He got into the passenger seat and waited for someone to drive him away. He didn't see Pete Clemenza sitting quietly behind him in the back seat. "Hello, Carlo," Clemenza said. Before Carlo could turn round, Clemenza threw a smooth thin cord around Carlo's neck and pulled hard. Carlo fought and tried to escape. His body jumped around like a fish on the end of a line. His foot crashed through the front window of the car, but Clemenza was too strong for him. He pulled the cord until it cut into Carlo's throat. A minute later, Carlo Rizzi was dead. Michael, who had watched it all from the front of the house, turned away, followed by Tom Hagen. He had taken care of all the family business in one day. The Corleones were now the strongest family in New York. He had reason to feel proud. When Connie heard that her husband was dead, she flew back at once to see Michael. She ran straight into his office and screamed at him. "You killed my husband. You waited until Papa died, and then you killed him. You blamed him for Sonny. You always did. Everybody did. You never thought about me. What am I going to do?" Michael sat quietly at his desk. Kate tried to calm Connie down, but Connie pushed her away, ran around the desk and started to kick and hit her brother, crying and screaming the whole time. "You stood godfather to our baby. You cold-hearted killer. You animal. You." Michael didn't try to move away. He let Connie scream at him and hit him. Finally, she was taken away into another room, and Michael was left alone with Kay in the office. He walked around the room, feeling uncomfortable at the strange look Kay was giving him. She was shocked by what had happened. She was also a little afraid. "She's gone crazy," Michael tried to explain. "Understandable, I guess." Kay could hear Connie screaming from the next room. She looked her husband in the eye and said, "Michael, is it true?" "Don't ask me about my business, Kay," he replied. "Is it true?" she repeated. Michael repeated his reply. When she asked him for the third time, he crashed his hand down onto the desk. "Enough," he shouted. Kay lowered her eyes and bit her lip. Finally, Michael said, "All right. This one time. I'll let you ask me about my business." "Is it true?" she whispered. Michael looked at Kay. He stood completely still. Then he shook his head and softly answered, "No." Kay was so happy that she almost started crying. She ran up to her husband and hugged him. A few minutes later, she moved back and looked at him. I guess we both need a drink." She tried to laugh. She left the office to get a drink. She was about to take the 2 glasses back into the room when she saw several men entering the office from another door. One of them was Pete Clemenza, the funny little fat man she had first seen dancing at Connie's wedding many years before. She watched in silence as he lowered his head, kissed Michael's hand and said, in a deep, respectful voice, "Don Corleone." Then someone gently closed the door, and Kay was left outside, alone. Her new life as the Godfather's wife had only just begun. The end.